And with that, let's kick off our fireside chat. Let me welcome Joaquin over to the stage. And which seat do you want? This one? Okay. Um, sounds good. Let me get my water over. I think you all, Joaquin is no stranger to you all. You've heard plenty from him this week so far, but I can guarantee you that none is comparable to what he's going to share in this fireside chat with me. And I know that, first of all, happy April Fool's Day. But there's not going to be any joke, right? It's all going to be very serious topic that we're going to go over. Please take a seat.
Yeah.
So, and we can get started. And what we're going to do is I have some questions that I prepared for him, but we all also have a Slido channel where you can ask all your questions. I believe that we also have a live version, or if people wanted to just unmute themselves and ask questions as well. So all possible channels to get your questions in. And we have about 40 minutes for the first part. Okay, sounds great. Are you ready?
I don't know.
I'll go easy on you. So, Joaquin, you have been working in the domain of applied ML for many years, right? You have spent 5 years in Microsoft, MSR, Ad Center, and then you also spent last 10 years as Facebook. So I'd love to maybe the first portion of our conversation focus a little bit more about maybe lessons you've learned, stories, behind the scenes stories you can share with the group. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Pleasure to be here. I'll start with a story that illustrates the need and the importance to really take risks, especially when we're an organization like ours that is operating at the edge of technology. So I wanted to visualize year 2012. Facebook IPO'd on May 18th, 2012, which coincidentally was also my birthday. And I had joined the company a few days earlier. I was ramping up, figuring out what to do. I decided to join the ads team and to build the ML team for ads. And the stakes were very high because revenue was flat and investors were really expecting a lot more. And maybe you don't remember, I certainly do, because after I joined, the stock price halved. It just went down. So I'm like, okay, maybe I should have joined a few weeks later, but it is what it is. And so in the middle of that, what I found was that on one hand, the models we were using to predict clicks and also to predict conversions were pretty basic. It was gradient boosted decision trees that were producing categorical features, and those were consumed later by linear models, logistic regression trained online in semi-real time. I used to call it the Soyuz, not fancy, but it gets the job done. And then I was really struck by the fact that it took like 6 weeks to go, or 6 weeks to 2 months to go from a candidate new model to it being, I'm learning the terminology here, to it being a MME or being fully shipped, right? And I thought, well, that's a problem. And so I felt there was this tension. I'm like, okay, well, do we try to replace the Soyuz by some fancy neural nets like deep and wide nets, which I guess were being invented at the time for ranking? Or should we just like build the tools so that we can actually go from research to production much faster? And I bet for the latter, right? And as a result, my boss, John Hegeman, this is November 2012, calls me. He says, hey, can we grab coffee? I'm like, okay. So we grab coffee at Fields on campus. And he says, Joaquin, I've noticed that your team has stopped shipping new models. Like, haven't you seen like revenue? The pressure is crazy. Like, what's going on? And I'm like, oh, yeah, we're cleaning the kitchen. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, no, listen, we're actually, John, yes, we haven't shipped models. And you know what? We're not going to ship models for another, couple of months. And then you could see he was just like pale, right? And so I explained, I said, well, listen, wizards don't scale. Like we hired these very strong ML applied researchers into the team, but right now we have a group trying to predict conversions, and they're developing these models in isolation, right? And even like data storage and format is actually incompatible with what the click prediction team is doing, right? There's no history. There's no way to keep track of who's done what. We're not storing learning curves. We're not storing sets of features. I can't figure out who's done what, right? So we're going to build this thing. The vision was we're going to build the factory. You know, wizards don't scale. Let's build the factory. And John was shocked but supportive. He saw it. We talked about the vision. The vision was like, hey, we're going to ship every week, and we're going to ship many models every single week. That sounded like science fiction at the time, but we knew that if we made that change, then investing in much fancier architectures would actually pay off, because you could actually iterate on them. Whereas otherwise, it'd just be like a one-off. It'd be like, okay, well, let's spend a couple of months, trying to insert a more fancy architecture into our pretty inadequate experimentation infrastructure, and then what? Anyway, that's one of my first stories, is how I told John, hey, we're not shipping models. We're taking a big risk here. Obviously, I'm telling the story because it worked, right? It worked, and the rest is history, right? And now the entire company is actually using what we started to build back in 2012. And we went to ship like dozens of models every week, and we created like super high levels of automation. But yeah, sometimes you have to make hard decisions like that.
That's a really, really good story. Guess what's going to happen? I already kind of see people start taking notes, and that's what's going to go and tell their managers. Joaquin said we can stop shipping models for a few weeks or months so that we can clean the kitchen sink. I love that story. If I think about the field that we are in, right? It's a field that it's moving, I don't know, 10,000 miles per hour, internally, externally, and it's existential for us to always innovate, right? Like what you have laid out, which is like, hey, we gotta first getting the productivity, the tooling in the right place. But I also think that there's just so much more to be prepared in order for the team to be able to innovate, right? And I'm not saying that just because, when we a few months ago, when we talk about the sort of the 3 strategic pillars for the data team, one of them is really pushing the boundary of innovation, of data innovation. But in your experiences, what are the key ingredients when you're thinking about innovation and pushing the boundary that's really needed for the team?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I could probably talk about that for hours. So you should stop me. The first thing is that innovation is a mindset, and it needs to affect every single thing you do, right? So in applied ML, which to continue the story, because the stuff we built was so successful and adopted everywhere, we built a centralized team called Applied ML that served all of Facebook. I had the honor to build up that team, and we needed a strategy. And we thought, well, innovation needs to be in everything we do. And what does the team do? 3 big things. One is build tools, platforms, and frameworks to really democratize and enable everybody to use ML and data easily, right? In doing so, you always have to be thinking, okay, how can I disrupt myself, right? I remember at some point, FB Learner, which is a tool we built, was going well, but it was pretty monolithic. And then we saw it. We knew the truth. The truth was that we had to do a massive rewrite, and it was going to be so painful. But you just have to do it. You can't continue incrementally. You just have to take a leap forward. Or when we worked on PyTorch as we know it today, and started to fantasize about Onyx, for those of you who know what that is, same thing. We knew that there was a lot of pain coming because we needed to migrate a lot of the teams to that. The other one, of course, is the push versus pull, right? Often when we work with product teams, they'll come and they'll say a bit like, I guess that quote, right? I want a faster horse. And maybe they don't know that you can actually give them a car, right? And for that reason, it's really important to simultaneously meet people where they are, right? So if you're serving a product team that needs a pretty massive scale recommender system, okay, let's go build a bigger one, right? Using the framework we have today. But at the same time, let's try to figure out what are the product experiences that we could build with AI as it's evolving that our partners in product teams might not even be aware of. And to give you some examples of that, the Facebook portal camera, which most people don't know about. Actually, raise your hand if you know about the portal camera. Some people do. That's pretty cool. I use it all the time because it has the camera itself doesn't move, but it has a pretty cool, these days simple, but it used to be fancy, computer vision algorithm that is really good at detecting and tracking people, and even infers like skeletal pose. And then there's an algorithm on top that was trained to mimic what a good cinematographer would do in terms of like zooming in and out, panning, and so on and so forth. The initial version of the Facebook portal was built by a little team that I built in Applied ML called AI Demos. And the reason to build AI demos was that you really have to inspire people. And the first version of Portal was actually mechanical because we hadn't figured out the tracking part first. And this is a true story. As Vincent, who was building this, was sort of soldering and messing with stuff, that the whole thing actually one day did catch fire in the office. But anyway, so then when Regina Dugan came and built the Building 8 team at Facebook, we chatted and she saw the demo, and that became actually the main strategy of that new organization. So you have to think about the push and the pull, right? The pull is product teams will our partners team will pull you in, will say, hey, listen, I need this. The push is very important too. We have to come and show them what's possible. Maybe another super quick example is at some point we built a computational photography team in 2015, which seemed a little exotic. But at the same time, I guess people were excited about virtual reality on the phone. And for some reason, that's gone now. But people were super excited about being able to have a little prancing horse, that you put on the chair, and then you look at it from different angles, and it's still there and stuff like that. So we also built demos of that and went to the camera team and said, hey, listen, this is ready to go.
I love that. When you said it's mechanical, I almost thought that you had somebody, is remote controlling the portal. But I hope that whatever demo that we are gonna be building here, no fires will be involved, or at least in a more controllable way.
If you don't have a fire every now and then you don't know if you're trying hard enough.
I love that. Actually, I'd love to expand that a little bit more. Something that actually just came to me since you talk about things that at the time was maybe a big hit, and now maybe it didn't go anywhere, right? Like same thing with a lot of things that we encounter as well. It's like maybe I pick up something, I was doing something, ended up not being successful, right? Like how do you think about the role that failure plays in innovation?
Yeah, I mean, there's no innovation without failure. That's pretty obvious, right? And one of the things that I would always discuss with the team is, if you're not failing, then I have no idea how far away you are from the boundary. So get closer to the boundary. But I think there's many different ways of failing, and I think the most important thing when you fail is to salvage a lot of learnings from your failure. And I think there's two ingredients that are important to do that. The first one is to be very deliberate. It's very, very important to stop when you're going to take a risk. It's very, very important to understand exactly why you're taking the risk and what your hypotheses are going to be, right? And I think meaningful risks are the one where you're confident about part of the technology or part of the bet, and then there's some question marks, right? And those question marks, you're going to make your best guess, but you know what they are, and you need to understand what they are. Because if you don't know what they are, then once you fail, you can't learn, right? So it's essential to be very deliberate first. Second, once you fail, you need to take time to learn from the failure. You have to document it. You have to write it down for others. You have to educate others. So that was one of the things that we always asked the team was fail, but before you fail, right? Know what you're trying to do and where the risks are. Let's just all be educated so that we understand, right? It also reduces surprises, which is nice. And then once you fail, which is fine, like we want you to fail maybe 50% of the time, depending on what part of the team or how much risk we're taking. Then make sure to take as much time as you need to really, really learn and become smarter.
That's really well said. And I remember this phrase about there's no such thing called failing. There's also only learning, right? If it's writing, I like, are there any tactics that you've seen that really worked that help motivate people to go and take those risks and be willing to fail, right? One thing that I constantly hear people saying is like, oh, if I'm not like if I go and take more risk, but that's not going to be rewarded, and like people's going to see me to be I'm failing, I'm not good at X, Y, and Z. Like how do you kind of combat that, and maybe providing some maybe more tactical tricks or consideration for people in the audience, either they are ICs or management, to think about how to encourage that behavior?
It's very hard, right? Because we all have performance reviews at Facebook. They used to be every 6 months, right? 6 months is not a long time. And then if after 6 months you have nothing to show for, then you're not going to get a good rating, right? It's very difficult to ask anyone to take risks if their performance review is at stake. It's just as simple as that. So on one hand, I think it's important to be extremely disciplined in rewarding intermediate results and learnings, and you have to be willing as a manager to give someone more than a meets all expectations, like exceeds, or I'm still learning. I guess I haven't gone through any performance reviews here, but I'm going to guess that they're the same everywhere. Yeah. Even if there was no material impact, right? If you're not willing to do that, then I don't think you can reward innovation, right? But remember what we said earlier, right? Like learnings, it's a lot of work to come up with convincing learnings. But if you hit your milestone, right, the thing failed, but you have convincing learnings, you must be ready to reward the person. That's one consideration. The other consideration is when it works, when you really knock it out of the park, then you need to celebrate like crazy. Then you need to go all out. And then you need to be ready. If someone has invested 2-3 cycles of their career, right, on a big bet, and the day it works, you can have zero hesitation. You need to go and reward that person in every way possible, because that has to be the example.
Yeah, and then not only rewarding it, but telling that story too.
Absolutely.
Right, so that everyone around them to realize, hey, wait a minute, like this person actually spent, like you said, 2 or 3 cycles to get the results that everyone is celebrating about. Yeah, and I just wanted to double click on your point on being very disciplined, and absolutely, I think it's we were actually discussing during the mid-year review cycle, how can we introduce that in a more rigorous way of rewarding and calling out? Either it's recognizing the key milestones, even though that they not necessarily have reached to the final result yet, or explicitly demanding a show of, hey, what are the intelligent risks has this person take, or what kind of failure has this person done, right? Has this person had, big or small? So more to come on that front. But I just think that in general, like, I like to tell people this, hey, if you're not taking risk now, if you're not failing now, your failures will get more and more expensive as you move up. So now, no other time is the time to actually have some failures and make mistakes. So anyway, that was a really good discussion. I actually would also, the one thing that I just remembered in our EVS, recent EVS results, folks have highlighted as something that we are not very good at, which is we're not very good at making decisions as a group, as a company, as a leadership team, and I would love for us to maybe spend a little bit of time talking about decision making in general, because I just remember having that conversation. We had this conversation, and I loved how you're thinking about that. Maybe you can share how you think about decision making, and maybe just how, like in general, with this group.
Yeah, I'll start also with a bit of a story. So, I almost became an academic, right? I did a postdoc in machine learning. I joined Microsoft Research, and I was a researcher there. And that's pretty much academia, at least in 2007 when I joined Microsoft Research. That was definitely the case. And I always observed this cultural shock between maybe the more scientific and academic minded and people responsible for execution and production. And that cultural shock was maybe due to the fact that when you're in a scientific mode, you're in truth-seeking mode, right? When you're responsible for running a complex operation, you need to enable and empower. And so the thing that I learned through the years from that friction between the two is that decision-making is not about getting it right. Decision making is not about seeking the truth. Decision making is about empowering and enabling and bringing clarity. It seems like a subtle thing, but once I understood it, it made my life so much easier. Because in the beginning, just to be very honest, when I transitioned from being a researcher at Microsoft Research to I moved to Bing in 2009 in the summer, which is remarkable that they would still have me after I told you some of the stories with Satya. Maybe we'll get to that later. I was a terrible decision maker. I would hesitate so long because I wanted to get it right, and people would be looking around me, Joaquin, which way are we going to go? Are we going to, like, I don't know, think about, PyTorch. Are we going to go like all in? Are we going to start, migrating? And we know that for inference, we can debug it very well. Or are we going to like stick with like custom build things, right? And I'd be like, I'll tell you tomorrow, like let me think more about it. And I just realized that most of the time, you just don't know what the optimal decision is, and you can't know it. But you can't leave a lot of people hanging, right? That doesn't make any sense. So as long as you're within the 180-degree cone, of like, yeah, this is like roughly, the right direction, just go, right? And then you learn more, right? And then you reevaluate. So again, I think as long as you're very transparent with people about why you're making that decision, right? It's also very important to go through all the phases, right? Like you have a phase where you're taking input from people, right? You're listening. When you're done listening, you process, then you summarize, you synthesize, you give it back to the team, and you say, all right, here's why we're making this decision. And then just create that culture that, hey, every decision is imperfect, but some are useful. And so you got to try and make more useful decisions. And again, with a team like ours, right, where many of us maybe come from a semi-academic or academic or scientific background, you have to fight. You have to fight this truth-seeking instinct, right? It's like, hey, there is a time for truth-seeking, and there's a time for getting stuff done.
I love that. I definitely had struggled that in the earlier days of my career as well. And I love this truth-seeking versus, making decision is really about enabling and empowerment in an organization like ours as well. And so it's okay to make a wrong decision, and like I said, all the decisions are imperfect, but some are useful. Really well said. So one other thing I wanted to touch upon, which is also, obviously, now that you've been at LinkedIn for a while.
5 weeks.
Feels forever. You also know how we are set up, right? So we are, a data function that we work very cross-functionally with many of our peers, even within the data team, but also outside of our data team as well, with product engineering teams, with product managers, and with sales and with marketing. And as you are thinking about interacting and collaborating with people, what are the lessons you've learned in your career that help you to be successful in bring people along and still establishing your identity?
Wow, that's a pretty deep question. A lot to unpack there. I'll start maybe by sharing some of my impressions in the first 5 weeks. It's very clear that LinkedIn has its own culture. It's a culture that feels different from anything I've seen before. Feels different from what I saw at Microsoft between 2007 and 2012. Feels different from what I've seen at Facebook for 10 years. And I would say the great thing about the culture here, I think, is that it's a lot more human than I've seen anywhere else, and less transactional, right? I've been in environments where a meeting lasts for exactly as long as you need to kind of sign the contract, both sides, and then you walk out of the room the moment the ink is on the paper, right? And that's it. You don't spend one more minute for pleasantries, right? I think that's good for speed of execution. I think it's not great because I think that my hypothesis is that it limits inclusiveness and it limits diversity of ideas, and it prevents people who maybe have a different style from being able to be part of the conversation. So I really, really treasure this aspect of the culture. at LinkedIn. And as a result, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get to know as many people as possible, and spending a ton of time, meeting people and trying to understand. Maybe the flip side of this, and again, like I might be getting ahead of myself because this is only 5 weeks, right? Is that when when I look at both like the complexity of the ecosystem of LinkedIn products, right? I didn't even know that we had 3 marketplaces. I came in here thinking, oh, we have mostly the talent marketplace, right? And then I heard, yeah, with the knowledge marketplace, I'm like, yeah, it's the same as a talent market. What's the difference? And I'm like, oh, wow, it is different. And then the B2B, commerce marketplace that I wasn't even really aware of because I haven't been on that side of the equation. So lots of complexity. I look at the complexity and richness of our data and the opportunity, and I think like, oh my God, that's crazy, right? And with that in mind, then the risk that I see is, do we say no enough, right? Are we good at saying no? And again, 5 weeks, my error bars are so broad. But my impression, if I had to bet money, I would bet that maybe we can be better at saying no. Maybe we can be better at, doing less, but better, and like laser focusing. So I'm trying to apply that to myself as well. At the moment, everywhere I look, I get excited and I see things. I was having a conversation with Suvik yesterday about and I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name, about our recommender systems, right? And I was like super excited, going deep and asking tons of questions. Prior to that, I've talked to Shaunak about AI fairness because I'm really excited about it. The same, right? Super excited. I've been talking to some people in the standardization team about knowledge representation, same thing. Get super excited. Everywhere I look, I get super excited. And so my biggest fear right now is like, okay, which one are you going to do first? How are you going to sequence this out, right? So yeah, building relationships, keeping on understanding things, and then just picking things and being patient and doing one at a time. I think that's going to be my approach, I hope. Let's see.
I love that. And also just and like saying no, I think that's something that we all need to work on better as well. I think a lot of times when we have this excitement and passion on just go solve a lot of problems that's in front of us, it's really hard for us to have that discipline, right? But also at the same time, I'd love to get to that Satya story, by the way, like in the collaboration setting as well. There are times when maybe there's the other teams are not necessarily not all stars are aligned to make things happen, and I'm sure like people in the audience experiences some of that, and like from time to time, right? Like how would you go about it?
Yeah, no, the stars are never aligned, right? There is a quote I heard someone at Microsoft Research say once. I'm trying to remember his name. I have a thread in the background of my head trying to remember the name. I don't have a lot of hope. He said, technology transfer is a full contact sport. And I thought there's a lot of truth in there. So I'll share a story that actually ties back to focus, right? So when I joined Microsoft Research in 2007, I was lucky that 2 weeks after I joined, Microsoft announced a company-wide competition to try and build the most accurate click prediction algorithm possible. They put a lot of work into the competition, and they shared the data set. The rules of the competition were very well thought through and everything. And we worked like crazy, a team of 4 people at Cambridge, in the Cambridge lab, right? There were 19 teams across the company in total who took part, right? Many from Microsoft Research in Redmond, many from other places across the company. And we won, which is awesome. We won, we're super happy. And there were 2 prizes. One prize was they would send the winning team to Hawaii for a week. So obviously that's good. But for me, the better prize, the much, much better prize, was that the winning algorithm was going to be productized. And for me, coming from a more academic background, this kind of opened my eyes and I never looked back, right? Like since then I was hooked, I was addicted, right, to shipping, right? But for me, it was like, wow, that is amazing. 1 year later, summer of 2008, our algorithm still had not been productized. And I was growing so frustrated. And of course, there were a lot of other things that I could work on, but we knew that this was significantly more accurate than the previous one. And 2008, we knew that Microsoft was going to start betting a lot on search, right? Bing launched 1 year later. Bing launched in summer 2009. And obviously, ads revenue was going to be a big deal if we had to fund search. So I just made it my life mission. I said, this is going to ship. And of course, I was 8 hours time difference away from Cambridge. So I started to travel to Redmond, like a lot. I remember this 1 year where I spent 59, I think it was 2008, 59 hotel nights that year. And I talked to everybody. I talked to the engineers in the R&R relevance and revenue team. I talked to program managers. I talked to executives, and still things were not moving fast enough. So then I thought, okay, I have to go nuclear on this one. I found out what building Satya Nadella was the head of the online services division at the time. He wasn't, the CEO of Microsoft just yet. And I kind of found out what building he was in. So then I looked, and there was an office, small office that was actually empty within like line of sight of Satya's office. So I started to camp there and stalk him. And then one afternoon, I just went in and I walked into his office. He was there. The door was open. I just walked in, and I just told him the story. And I said, "I'm so frustrated. Here's what's going on." And he was shocked. At some point, I thought he was going to call security. Like he asked me, "What's your alias?" And I thought, oh crap. So I walked out of the place, and he said, "Well, I'll follow up." Next day, he hasn't followed up. So I'm like, okay. So then this is the crazy part of the story. Then I'm like, okay. Then I see he's in his office. I'm like, I don't dare to walk in again. But I see he goes to the restroom. I'm like, okay, let me also go to the restroom. So we go to the restroom, and we're both like, he's at a urinal, and I'm like, okay, let me use a urinal next to him. So I go there, and I'm standing, and then he looks at me, and it's like, oh, it's you. He says, oh, did I follow up? I'm like, no, Satya, you did not follow up. Oh, I've got it. So anyway, it took actually 2 or 3 of those until he finally followed up. But that was like the level of commitment, and I'm skipping like, tons of other things that I did to really sort of make people aware that this had to ship. The thing shipped summer 2009 with Bing, and actually the Bing team asked me if I would then move over, leave research, and become an engineering manager and lead the click prediction team, which I did. So that's how the story ends.
That was such a great story. I just really wanted to remind everyone in the audience that just take the spirit, not the tactics. Thank you, Joaquin, so much for lots of amazing insights.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. And stay tuned. Next time we do this, I'll make sure to remember some other stories. I don't know if they'll be as outrageous as the urinal one, but we'll try.